My presentation today is about the ontology of diabetes camp. And that's today's date, in case you were wondering. So before I talk about what's going on this slide, I'm going to go back one, but I just want to give you a taste of what's to come and give you a non-ontological description of what I mean when I say use the term diabetes camp. So diabetes camp is a summer camp for kids with diabetes. It's run by the American Diabetes Association. There's approximately 50 or so of these camps spread throughout the United States. It's a normal summer camp, meaning that these kids do normal summer camp activities like go swimming, there's a rock climbing wall, play lots of soccer, and be very active in general. It's atypical from a normal summer camp in that all of the attendees have diabetes. Now, this is not a talk about the physiology of diabetes, but to give you a very gross understanding of what's going on, which is necessary for the rest of this talk, diabetes is a disease with problems in glucose metabolism, we'll say. So these kids who have diabetes, their bodies can't regulate their own sugar in their blood, the amount of sugar in their blood on their own. And so they have to take care of it using, let's say, injectable insulin, for example. So a lot of that information that specifies how much insulin a person needs is collected by a person such as myself who works at a diabetes camp. For example, the local one in Rochester known as Camp Aspire. Specifically, here's an example of the paper medical records that we currently use at Camp Aspire. There's a lot going on here, so stick with me. All of these fields up here, these boxes, are where medical staff, such as myself, fill out information that's key to helping us control a camper's blood sugar throughout the week. Okay? That's all you need to know about that. Unfortunately, none of these forms that are used throughout any of the camps in the United States are standardized in any way. To prove that, here's an example of a form that's used at a different camp. You can see that it looks a lot different, and so I can tell you for sure that some fields which are on the previous example, the ones that we use, for example, in the upper right, active insulin, last site change, which you don't need to know what those mean. You just have to recognize that they're not present on this form, which is used at a different camp. So this incongruity between camps is one of my motivations for building an ontology of diabetes camp. Another motivation is someday I wish to create an electronic medical record which is used at these diabetes camps, and having a good ontological understanding of what's going on will be very useful in that partaking. So these are two examples of forms. I want to show you another form that we use because it'll be important in an example I show at the end. There's a lot going on. The text is small. I understand that. But it's just important to recognize from this slide that we record certain fields about a camper's glycemic control at times throughout the day, on days throughout the week. That's all I'm trying to show here. Okay? I think you'll get a better understanding of it when I talk about the ontology aspects of it. Again, to show more motivation, this is the form we use at Camp Aspire in Rochester, New York, where I've worked for 8 years. This is a form that's used at a different camp. As you can see, it's set up differently. The boxes, the labels of what they're recording are different. It's kind of a mess. It's all over the place between camps. So to build my ontology of diabetes camp, I, of course, followed the guidelines outlined by Dr. Smith and others in building ontologies with basic formal ontology. And I'm going to go through these steps right now to describe my process of what I've built. So the first process, demarcate the subject matter of the ontology. Now, the first slide I showed, my title slide, was this, the ontology of diabetes camp. Thinking about this for a long time, I've decided that even that title is a little bit too broad in scope. There are many aspects of the camp experience itself which I'm not going to try and capture. So I narrow it to the ontology of medical care at diabetes camp. But there are a lot of aspects of medical care which I'm not capturing, which you'll see in just a few more slides, that I'm not capturing in my ontology. So this is a narrow enough but broad enough to be useful title, The Ontology of Diabetes Care at Diabetes Camp. So the next step is to gather terms and information. Don't try and read all of these. This is just, suffice it to say, these are a lot of terms that I've gathered as a domain expert along with other domain experts about things that need to be captured in my ontology. Specifically, here they all are laid out in a nice is a hierarchy with a few extra relations highlighted because I didn't want to put those on any extra slides. In general, I use basic formal ontology as my top level ontology and made judicious use of the ontology for biomedical investigations and the information artifact ontology as mid-level ontologies. So it just so happens that one of the examples which is elucidated in great detail in OBI is the process of measuring glucose concentration in serum, which is over here, OBI measuring glucose concentration in serum. And in fact, that is even specified to have an output. OBI has specified output, not as a blood glucose reading, which is a term that I've created, which encapsulates the output of this process in OBI. In OBI specific, this points to measurement datum. To better capture what I mean by the output, I've created this new term, blood glucose reading. A lot of this I'll talk about on subsequent slides, but a few of it I won't, so I'm just going to mention one more thing here. Insulin pump. Insulin pump is a small OBI device which can deliver insulin automatically and with input from a human user. So that differentiates it from an insulin pen, which is down here, which is also a device, but a pen cannot deliver insulin automatically. I'm wearing an insulin pump right here, and it's connected to me, and it's delivering insulin as we speak. I can also push some buttons to make it deliver more insulin if I so choose. So those are both devices, and a pump has as part a computer, whereas a pen does not. They both have as parts syringes, however. This other stuff I'll cover in subsequent slides, like right now. To define diabetes camp, so I'm going to regiment everything a little more specifically. So I wanted to first describe what is diabetes camp from an ontological sense. I told you what it means to, let's say, a person who's unfamiliar with ontology, what they mean when they say something like this. So the ontology for biomedical investigations has a term, organization. Examples of subtypes of organizations in OBI include things like hospitals, agencies, groups of individuals. And so for that reason, I'm going to call a camp an OBI organization which has appropriate facilities for hosting kids, for example, in an overnight setting and having lots of fun. I'm going to call a subtype of camp a medically focused camp. So there are camps for kids with, or there are other types of camps. For example, I think nice demarcations would be art camps, for example, or sport camps as other subtypes. As a defined class subtype of medically focused camp, I'm going to use a term called diabetes camp. And what I mean by diabetes camp ontologically is that in all of the attendees of this camp, there inheres some OGMS disease, which is diabetes, in all of the campers. So a medically focused camp would be there inheres some OGMS disease in the campers, whereas this is the OGMS disease is diabetes. Camp Aspire is the local example, which I mentioned a few times, where I work. That's an instance of this defined class that I'm calling diabetes camp at some time. So one thing I thought about a great deal when thinking about important things I need to capture with my ontology was where exactly a camper will be injecting insulin. So using the vaccine ontology as a model, I just settled on using the BFO term site. The vaccine ontology says that a vaccination site is a BFO site, essentially where a vaccine is given. Analogously, I'm going to define a phrase, insulin administration site, which I think everyone would agree is very similar to where, for example, you get your flu vaccine up in your shoulder. You might take an insulin injection site, might be the back of your arm. An important consideration for me was there are new insulins out there which can be inhaled. And so I have to include the term insulin inhalation site, which is still an insulin administration site. However, it might be, for example, a nostril as opposed to the back of your arm. Another mid-level ontology, which I haven't mentioned but I did use, was the Ontology of Medically Related Social Entities, OMR-SE. And this defines things such as physician role or nurse role under the supertype of healthcare provider role. So I define a subtype of healthcare provider role as a diabetes camp medical staff role, which includes as subtypes medical director role, medical coordinator, lead medical staff role, and medical staff role. For example, if that's not clear, we can say that this is me. I'm an instance of Homo sapiens at some time. And there inheres in me, this is supposed to be a diamond, there inheres in me some instance of lead medical staff role at some, it inheres in me, and that role is an instance of lead medical staff role. Analogously, a medical coordinator, instance of a medical coordinator role might inhere in some other person, let's say Diana. And that's her real name. That's her real medical coordinator's name. It's important to note also that there is a relational quality between instances of Homo sapiens in whom certain roles inhere. For example, the human being, the instance of human being in whom a specific instance of medical director role inheres has authority over all other human beings in whom other instances of other diabetes camp medical staff roles inhere. Medical coordinator would have authority over lead medical staff and medical staff, but not over medical director. So it's like in the leftward direction, I'll say. Okay. One important thing I need to describe is blood glucose. So I struggled with this definition and coming up for what it is for a long time. With some help from Werner, I decided it was a BFO quality, similar to how temperature of a body is a quality. So I say that blood glucose is a physical quality that inheres in blood by virtue of concentration of glucose in serum, and that a blood glucose reading is the scalar measurement datum, which is the specified output of some process measuring glucose concentration in serum. So this allows us to say things like Rob Smith's blood glucose exists at all times that Rob Smith exists. And at some time, T1, let's say, it instantiates a blood glucose of this particular level, 208. Don't worry about what these values mean. Of 208, which is a above target range blood glucose, which is a blood glucose. Defining blood glucose as a quality allows us to do that, and then at the same time say that later, at some time T2, Rob Smith's blood glucose instantiates a blood glucose of 120, which is a within target range blood glucose, which is a blood glucose, which is a quality. Very handy. So let's consider a few small examples. Let's say that Rob Smith wakes up and it's 7:30 in the morning and his blood sugar is 208. So me being on the medical staff, this is a zoomed in portion of the form I showed you earlier, would write 7:30 a.m. in this box that says time, 208 that says BG for blood glucose, and if I calculated that he needed 2.8 units of insulin based on some of the parameters that we collect, which were on the other form, which are defined, which I don't have time to go through, I would say he needs 2.8 units of insulin. This is how we would represent that, or how I would write that in the standard form right now. Ontologically, I could say that Rob Smith participates in, RO is relation ontology. Rob Smith participates in the correction bolus injection, which is a process, and is a subtype of OBI subcutaneous injection of OBI dose of 2.8 units of insulin. So keep correction bolus injection in the back of your mind, because if Rob Smith goes to breakfast and eats 65 grams of carbs, which are something which is important for someone with diabetes to be aware of how much they eat, again, using some formulas, I decide he needs 4.3 units of insulin. Ontologically, we could say Rob Smith participates in food bolus injection, which is a subtype of subcutaneous injection of a certain dose of insulin. Is that clear to everyone? So this example that I've just shown you is kind of the basic, the most core thing that needs to be represented in an ontology of diabetes care at Diabetes Camp. And this is one of the more basic things that will need to be represented in any electronic medical record version of these paper notes that I create. And so that's one of my future steps, is building that EMR and incorporating this ontological knowledge into it. Additionally, I still need to put this into an OWL file, and so I can make it pretty with Protege, build a few more relational qualities between a camper and a medical staff, for example, and just include more of what Diabetes Camp entails that I haven't talked about right now. For example, the counseling staff or other treatments that may be used at camp. All right. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And hopefully you see that this project has a lot of future. This is one of my domain experts, Dr. Diana Miller. That's me. Thank you for all those people for their help. Any questions?
So you lose the point because you didn't put slide numbers on your slides. That's going to make it hard for me to ask all my questions. So we'll see if anyone else has questions.
I do, but I can wait.
Small question. Should it be blood glucose level?
So that is something that I struggled with for a really long time, like days actually. And what it came down to is that we don't say, or what's in other ontologies is not necessarily temperature level or mass level. It's just temperature and mass. And I think that this is analogous to those qualities. But I did struggle with that.